Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you joining the Q&A and hopefully asking some great questions and get some good info. Hope you guys were able to watch the first webinar that we recorded in our series. We'll have a second one coming out here before too long, talking all about government contracting and OneStream and financial planning and transformation. So yeah, I think we'll try to get straight to the questions. I believe hopefully we have some questions coming in from YouTube. If you definitely have any, please feel free to put them in the chat and our host will bring them over. So we'll start with a couple questions that we got submitted to us that people who weren't able to attend ahead of time. And so Colt, I think this first one is something interesting we're talking about. How do you handle planning for subcontractor labor? Subcontractors that can be just staff aug, using time cards or just invoiced amounts. If they're not people that are planned directly in the system, how are we handling that?
Yeah, so I think you can handle it a bunch of different ways, and it really depends on what's easiest for your budget stakeholders, as well as how the data needs to get in to allow the budget to calculate correctly. So obviously, if they are in the system, if there are hourly rates associated with subcontractor labor, or you can put in planned hourly rates for different subcontractor labor types, you can plan out by hours and let a project budgeting solution or some other solution calculate out how those hourly rates and number of hours you're forecasting across time come out to raw costs, how that actually burdens up and how that creates revenue. When you're talking about T&M based forecasting, of course, you have to have the hourly rates and you have to budget by hours because you have to build up costs and more importantly have to get the calculated revenue based off of T&M categories and the associated rates for those T&M categories. So there's a lot of ways to solve for it, which is you could do it by hour, even if they're not using your time card system, even if they are just submitting invoices, if you have T&M reasons for doing that. Or if you don't have reasons to need to do that, there's no harm in also just budgeting flat dollar amounts if you don't need that hourly data as part of your budget solution.
Sure. And so how does that interact with indirect rate buildup? Is there any particular interesting interaction there, or is it just pretty typical?
I think it's just a matter of the different ways you get to the raw dollar amounts and then how that ends up getting into your different cost pools and cost bases that creates your overall forward pricing rates.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So just, again, getting the dollars into the correct buckets to be spread out, it just doesn't really add any additional complexity on top of that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Great.
That makes sense. All right, well, we'll move on to our second question, and I think I could probably comment a little bit on this, but I'm definitely interested in your opinion. If I add this on top of Deltek CDP was the question, do people now have to double work in two different systems? So I would say no. I mean, no is the answer, is the easy answer. We don't ever want to introduce double work. That's never part of something that we would engineer from a process perspective. Even though we're spending a lot of time talking about tooling and about what OneStream's capable of. I know we at Archetype, and I know that Colt, you guys at Big Utility did the same thing. We're not just talking about technology. This process question here. It always integrates with the process, and having people do double work is just. We're here to save time and money, not increase, right, the cost of those things. So no's the direct answer. And this does kind of tease into that second webinar where we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the different types of planning you can do in OneStream. In fact, talking a little bit about replacing CDP entirely. But for the first webinar that we did, where we were just really talking more about indirect rates and the general process, you can have OneStream take over just individual parts of that as necessary. So like, for example, with the indirect rate stuff, we were still pulling, at that time, data from cost point budgeting and planning into the system, right, to then calculate the rates off of. So it wasn't, people having to do double entry. We were able to integrate and pull that data out of cost point, just like we're pulling the other data points out of cost point. So yeah, definitely not double work in two different systems, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about what that looks like to have both up live at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it's not any different, like you were saying, than pulling actuals. It's just that there's a component of your budget that you might pull from a different solution, like cost point planning, because cost point planning is a good project budgeting solution. So you could certainly do your project budgeting in cost point planning and then integrate that plan data into the OneStream application so that you can build up your AOP and your forecast and leverage a lot of that data and process that you're doing currently in cost point planning to do your ETCs and your EACs, and just integrate that data and or leverage that data to build up to an AOP or build up to a forecast. I think, you know, more specifically, it's all about also trying to understand what level of detail you want to pull out of that solution and then pull into OneStream, either just as, relational tables that you can drill back to, or whether or not, what level of data and detail you want to bring into your cubes, right? Because there's some trade-offs between what data you just bring over and you can access from OneStream, because it's a lot of detail when you're talking about project budgeting, and then what data you decide that you actually want to integrate and feed into your cubes for, the more ad hoc analytics and reporting.
Yeah, well, that's always really a question, honestly, that we talk about, kind of regardless of what vertical industry sector, right, you want to talk about, is what level of detail do we want to be planned in the cube, um, or reported in the cube, for that matter, because you do want that analytical capability. That's a big part of the value you get out of any system like OneStream with the multi-listener database, is that ability to do that analysis, and also to speed up the entry um, of your data too, from a planning perspective. They're just more intuitive in many ways for inputting planning data, I think, at least in my experience. And so, you're always kind of trying to trade off what level of detail do I want to bring into the cube. And again, maybe as a quick teaser, another example, that's people planning. Like, do you really want to have people as a dimension in the system? Sometimes there's reasons to do that, but oftentimes we like to keep that data off in relational tables or in other places where it lives a little bit more, again, intuitively. And the cube, where we have the slice and dice and drilling, we keep a little bit more compact for usefulness, and also not creating problems, because just like any other good tool, it can be a bit of a double-edged sword, right? You don't want to go too crazy with dimensionality, or you really lose some value. So, yeah, I think that's really fair. It's good points to point out.
Yeah, I agree. And for people that actually are on Deltek Cost Point, I think the parallel there is somewhat like the project ledger and Cost Point, which is it's a little more summarized at the project account or period combination. That's probably the right amount of level of detail that you actually want to bring into your cubes for your project data within OneStream.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good parallel.
I see a
Okay,
couple other
so
people joined, so just so you know, at any point, if you have any question, please feel free to put it in the chat. We're happy to answer along the way. We're working through
yeah,
some questions that we got in advance of the webinar.
yep. So one of the one that we have here, what are some general best practices for budgeting as a government contractor? I'll let you take that one to start for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we could talk about a ton here as a government contractor, but also just generally from a budgeting and forecasting standpoint. I think one that just always cuts across the board is leveraging all of your data, and you're trying to kind of integrate your disparate processes, right? And so I'll go back to project budgeting as an example, right? A lot of government contractors out there are doing ETCs and EACs on a regular basis just to manage individual project budgets, but they're not actually leveraging that data when it comes to building up their forecast or AOP. And I mean, either directly feeding into it, or at least using it as an informative data set to know, okay, hey, here's what I actually am budgeting or forecasting in my AOP for top line revenue, expenses, bottom line, right? But how does that actually tie back to the projects I have in hand and the potential new business that I'm going after? And on the new business front, the same thing goes for Salesforce data or CRM data in general, right? You have your opportunity pipeline. That's a whole bunch of data that you can leverage to really start to forecast out, okay, well, I know how much I have in hand. Well, how much should I actually be forecasting from new business, right? What's my historical win rate? What's my P wins across all the opportunities I have out there? How much of where I'm standing now actually tells me of how much I have next year, and how much do I actually not even find out about until the next year, right? And just trying to figure out the total pieces across these different systems that you can kind of gather all that data, put it in one place, and build up to a really informed budget, right? And then the other, independent process that we see a lot of times is, your forward pricing rate calculations. everybody puts all their data in these performance management solutions. They build up to their total expected revenue, expenses, bottom line. But a lot of times what they don't do is necessarily leverage that exact same data to build out their FPR. And the ones
Mm-hmm.
that do it a lot are doing that in Excel, right? They're pulling that data out and doing it in Excel and not actually allowing a performance management solution to go through and calculate those pools, calculate those bases, calculate those rates, then throw that data back into a cube for ongoing analytic purposes where you can do budgets versus forecasts versus actuals and monitor all your indirect costs, all your indirect rates and pools on an ongoing basis throughout the year.
Yeah. Well, and really, I think that was a lot of the value that we talked about in that first webinar, right? Was why even to do that? And I think it was a great summary of what you just said right there, and then kind of how we went about doing it. So again, if you weren't able to watch that webinar, definitely highly recommend to check it out. We went a little more in depth into that topic specifically. All right, we got one coming up now. So this is a YouTube one. How do other government contractors solve timing issues between their AOP needs to be completed versus their forward pricing needs to be submitted? Great question. You want to take that one first, or?
Yeah, no, that is a good question. And I think it really depends on the timing, right? So when, does corporate or the board or whatever, when do you have to finalize your budget by, right? When do you need the final approval from the board um, for your budget? And when do you actually also have to submit for your forward pricing rates to the government, right? What are those deadlines? A lot of times, AOP or your first budget comes first because you typically want to have something finalized earlier on, a few months in advance, whereas your forward pricing rates are usually about 2 months in advance. So a lot of times you have to actually build up to your AOP first, right? And so what you can do, especially if you've got a way to automate the calculation, is you can build up to your AOP and you can calculate an initial set of forward pricing rates for your AOP. And then you can flow those new rates through your project budgeting solution or whatever you're doing to build up to new burdens, to build up to new revenue calculations based off of where you think you're going to be for the current first budget that you're submitting to your board or submitting to leadership for approval, right? Then if there's minor changes along the way until you finalize your forward pricing rates and actually submit them, right? That's what you would then go ahead and roll into a revised budget or roll into your first quarterly or monthly forecast, and then just kind of take it from there. And then, monitoring your rates throughout the year to know whether or not you're on track for where you thought you would be at each month or each quarter on a year-to-date basis, and determining whether or not that's going to create a massive impact to where you initially thought you were going to be in your original budget or AOP.
Yeah, well, and I think what you're saying there really ties into the last point you made, which is when you have this FP or this rate calculation, I should say, the indirect rate calculation in your CPM system, it becomes so much easier to tightly integrate that and to shorten that cycle, right? I think a lot of people have longer cycles because they got to build this whole budget and then, like you said, move it all into Excel and start playing with the numbers there. And it's really, it's tough. Whereas there's no reason, as you were building up the budget, even before you completed, that you couldn't run your calculations and just see how you're developing. Like as we're going, as we're getting more information, as we're tweaking, where do we see our rates moving? Because you can run them in, I think, about 10 minutes in general is what we're looking at a fairly complex pool structure and with a lot of data. The lighter your data load, the lighter your pool structure, the faster that goes. So the ability to iterate quickly on that, I think, is a huge part of the reason that there's a lot of value to bring that in. And it, like you said, makes that cycle shorter. The other thing, too, again, going back to the process from that very first question, is it is important to line your process up correctly, right? You don't want to be doing your budgeting, right in tandem with your FPR submission, because then you're just kind of hoping they line up, So,
Yeah. And naturally, a lot of places are going to have, variations between, especially depending on how far apart the timing is, variations between what they finalized as their first budget for the upcoming fiscal year versus what they end up submitting for with their forward pricing rates. And actually, one of the native functionalities of OneStream and using adjustment forms is nice because, if you take your AOP data out of your, budget cube or whatever you're calling that cube, and you're pulling it in to an indirect rate cube for your rate calculations, you can make adjustments directly to the indirect rate cube where you want to make tweaks to your FPR to get to certain rates. right?
Yeah.
So it really allows for that iterative process
Mhm.
between AOP and FPR where they don't have to be independent of one another. They're kind of working
Yeah.
congruently. And then you just finalize one. And then if you have tweaks along the way after that, then you get to a slightly different answer. And once you've got to
Yeah.
that slightly different answer, you're just rolling that into your next scenario.
Yeah. And again, I think it's all about balancing and finding. I really like the word intuitive when I talk about this stuff because a lot of the things we have to do make these processes kind of unintuitive. Like the whole copying from Excel, it's like I don't want to do that, and it unlinks everything. And so that anytime I make changes to my budget, I've got to do this huge process to make sure that everything in my other Excel is up to date, that I'm not missing large chunks of data that were added. Whereas if you can just kind of intuitively link them, still allowing the flexibility, that's the other thing. You don't want to get too rigid, right? Where like, oh no, you only have budget data, and so you've got to. It's like no, you want to give the indirect rate team often, or whoever's doing that work, the flexibility to do what they need to do to get their job done, but while also making it as easy as possible for them to inherit the correct data from upstream, right? So yeah, I
Right.
think that's a,
Right.
a really interesting question or answer, I should say. All right, great, right in time. What are the benefits of calculating indirect rates and costs within OneStream? Well, I think we've been kind of hitting on a lot of those points. Again, I think the biggest one, and Nicole, I think you would say this as well, is just having all that data ready for analysis. When I have all of my, effectively, again, from a cost point perspective, org account, information available to see what went into my pools from a budget perspective versus what actually went into my pools from an actual perspective versus maybe where my forecast lands and how each of those situations has different rates. I think that is probably the biggest single win of having it in a CPM system or like OneStream, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree, and I think we were talking about this just before this question came through. Is the iterative nature that it allows for, right? You can make iterations to your budget or forecast or plan data, and then seamlessly calculate them rather than having to extract them out into an Excel file or somewhere else where you're calculating this out at. So you can make it very iterative. As you make plan changes, you can just let the system recalculate it, right? Rather than trying to take those changes, flow them into some offline Excel-based model. The other thing that I think is the biggest selling point is, the time series forecasting and, leveraging some of the tools that OneStream can offer you in this area. And then also just being able to really understand where you should be at different points in the year and getting better and better at planning that way. And so I think Fringe is always a good example, right? Fringe pools naturally start off high in the beginning of the year because you have a bunch of upfront fringe benefit costs. You also have a lot of holidays and you have a lot of PTO taken. Same thing happens in summertime. There's different points of the year where different costs kind of fluctuate, right? Nothing's a straight line, right? And so if you've gotten to a place where, hey, I'm not just budgeting a total amount for the year for these different indirect cost pools, right? I'm actually using historical actuals to help inform me about how those costs should trend over time. You can
Mm-hmm.
build that into your budget or forecast, and you can calculate your forward pricing rates by month to have it that same way, right? So when you go into your indirect rate cube, you can go look at it and say, okay, hey, even though my fringe rate was going to be, I'm just making percentages up, 40% at the end of the
Yeah.
year, I know through February it's really going to be at 50%. And
Yeah.
so if I'm at 48% through February, that might look bad when I compare it to 40% on the full year, but I know that that's actually good. And I'm actually trending below where I had forecasted, right? And you can do this
Yeah.
across all of your pools, right? So at any point in time, year to date, you can say, what's my budget? What's my new forecast for this point in time year to date? And what are my actuals? And do those ad hoc analytics and comparisons to really know where you're trending to on a full year basis and be really informed and smart about whether or not you're actually too far off from where you should be.
Yeah. Well, and so I'll take that a little bit of a step further too. I really like that idea of fringe is when you link, and again, I'm teasing upcoming webinars, but when you link in people planning potentially, one of the things that I personally really love to advocate for all people planning is using your historical trends for fringe benefits, right? And just saying, hey, for example, oftentimes it makes sense to do it almost at like a departmental level, because you'll get swings in ways that you can anticipate. That, like, maybe my engineering takes bigger summer holidays or less summer holidays, right? Maybe they're cranking down over the summer in preparation for something, and they actually just take the whole month of December off. Whereas like HR's, they got to close the year, and then they take big vacations of like April or May or something, right? Because they're done with something, right? And so you can get decently accurate curves with those fringe benefit percentages that you can again use OneStream to as a driver to then calculate by person. Well, we know these many people are in this department, and we're thinking about hiring X number of new people, et cetera. And that will, get you a little bit tighter forecast of how those fringe benefits are going to fall out over time, to then directly inform the indirect rate calculations, right? So now that I've done my indirect rate calculations in OneStream and I've set it all up, if I then add that people planning component to it, it just flows in directly, right? And so I get that benefit of the more accurate forecast piece by piece by piece, and so you can really build up to it. So yeah, I don't know,
Yeah, no, and I agree. I mean, if you want to be that exacting on your fringe benefit costs and you want to do it by employee, the people planning solution is great for that, because
yeah,
you can essentially then build up all of the different additional employee costs that kind of create your fringe expense pools and then
yeah,
load them into your plan data.
yeah.
Um, I think another question that came through are what are the different calculations the allocation engine and OneStream can handle?
Yeah, well, I mean, great thing about OneStream is we can do. I always like to say, and I really truly mean it, we can do anything. It's only ever a question of what should we do, what makes sense to do. And I think leaning on our experience there, the big thing that we really wanted to hit, that we wanted to get perfectly right the first time with us, were the pools. That being the most common example of how we calculate our rates, right? So making sure you have just cost pools with cost and base, right? Or base, yeah, so that's right, cost and base. I always get those mixed up. But we also have built in a number of different pools, like multi-factor jobs, some PMO pools, some direct allocation pools as well. Am I missing some there? That's just off the top of my head quickly. I think there was like maybe
No,
one more.
yeah, I mean, I think the key takeaway here is, like you said, like if the data is there in OneStream, you can create the calculations that you want to
Yeah.
do to have it actually do it on forecast, do it on actuals, do it on budget, right? Any scenario that the data is available for, right? So I know that sometimes people use like standard is, hey, I have different types of expenses and burdens that are in my basis, right, for the pool basis. But we've been able to handle multi-factor revenue bases, headcount bases,
Mm-hmm.
direct allocations, service centers, the entire pool structure. Even if your base accounting ERP system can't do some of those things and you have workarounds for them,
Yeah.
there's ways that you can do them in your performance management solution. And not only can you do in your performance management solution, but say you are a big company that has multiple companies spread across different ERP solutions, and your
Yeah.
shared services home office has to allocate down, and you have to do those calculations offline to tell the
Mm-hmm.
system how those need to allocate out, and then do your intercompany transfers to move your indirect costs between systems or between companies in the same system, right?
Yep.
Well, you don't have to do that if you're feeding all that data to one performance management solution, and it can handle those calculations for you and tell you, okay, hey, here's how you go tell your accounting system, this is what I needed to be able to actually flow my home office, flow my shared service costs down through all of my supporting, all of my entities or CAS segments.
Yep. Um, So, oh man, shoot, I literally just lost something. Oh yeah, going back to the multiple ERPs too, right? I mean, again, that's a real strength of OneStream specifically, but any system out there. That idea of being able to bring all that data together. Also, when we generate these calculations, I'd like to point out that I mean, it's true we could do anything, but one of the things that we at Archetype specifically try to do is not engineer solutions that are way too rigid, right? Because I mean, it's true. I mean, I can hard code on just about anything. I can hard code the calculation to go, hey, go grab this data point and then this data point and then this data point. But that's not particularly useful if tomorrow you need a fourth or need to drop off that third, right? That's not a useful way to set a system up. And that was one of the ways that we really focused on in generating this, indirect rate engine that we built, was making sure it was highly configurable. And going back to the webinar, pulling down our initial set of definitions from the ERP, or some of them being uploaded to OneStream via Excel since they were Excel based, and then allowing them to be changed from for especially for a budgeting perspective or forecasting, because you know you're going to have some new pools or make some adjustments. But again, having that be a relatively intuitive and seamless process as much as possible, so that it's super easy to just get the base data and modify it, and from a definitions perspective, and then the system just knows how to go do those calculations based on the definitions and the data, right? And that makes it, I think, easy to use, and that's a real concentration for us when we do this stuff. Um,
Yeah, I agree. I
so,
think it's easy to pull down, account org or account cost center combinations for how your pool definitions are all set up in your core accounting system. But
mhm,
the other neat thing was, giving the end users the ability to make those modifications on the front end, right? Like you said, not having to have back end code. So giving them dashboards or interfaces where they can make changes to those. And for some of the pools, like if you're doing revenue basis or multi-factor or PMO or something, allowing them to say, okay, well, here's the members in my different dimension hierarchies that I want to go grab those values for the cost pool, for the cost base. And so it kind of gives the end user control over actually making changes to that on the fly without having to worry about any of the back end code that actually runs through the calculations.
yeah, exactly, and that's what I was trying to say, right? Is making it super configurable. And again, OneStream gives us that flexibility. It gives us the flexibility to create the user experience, the UI, to support that intuitively, right? We were able to build a dashboard with all these definitions that makes it easy to filter through and find what the definition is, and then click in and make some changes and hit save, or export and make some quick changes in Excel and then re-upload them, right? The ability to again have your own easy, intuitive way to manage these definitions and not having to worry about how the calculations actually take place. And the system's going to handle that. So yeah, yeah, I think that's really fair. So another question just came in. What are some of the biggest challenges of the allocation engine? Man, I think validation that you have all the correct definitions and data points was the biggest one. I mean, anytime you're talking about a system that is built to handle huge volumes of data, there's always potential that data points are going to fall out that you didn't correctly, bring over some of the data, because there's some things that we didn't want to bring over. We wanted to make sure that the cube only had the data necessary to do the calculations, but maybe later we realized we left out some data that was actually needed, right, for a calculation or two. And so making some tweaks like that. But that process of going in, pulling the data, running the calc, and then comparing it, we were comparing against actuals too, right, to make sure that we were actually matching the methodology completely correctly. And so making sure all of our rates for all of our pools were correct, and where they weren't, having to dig down and go, what's going on? And that was probably the biggest single challenge, yeah, that I could think of. I don't know, Cole, what's your thought?
Yeah, data validation is definitely a challenge. It's something, I mean, you obviously have to get through and you have to tie out. It just depends on the complexity of the pools for how much of a challenge it's going to be. If you're talking 5, 10, 20 pools, easy. If you're talking 100 some pools, obviously that's a lot more validation. And every little issue you have upstream, it flows downstream. And so you just got to take it like one pool at a time and just work through and figure out what the issues are. From an actual standpoint, if you've actually brought in the definitions the same way, if the calculations are being built the same way, and if the results are expected to be the same way, that should make it a little bit easier, but there's still a lot to work through. I think the other thing is you could decide to calculate actuals in OneStream, in the allocation engine, or you could really just take your actual calculations from your ERP system and just feed that directly to the cube. That there's two options there. But the big thing that we've also found is just timing and changes in the data or definitions, right? So if you don't have a hard close, right, and you run the pools, but then accounting is in there posting additional stuff after you've run the pools for that period, and you don't rerun the pools, right? There's obviously going to be differences between, okay, well, we just brought all this data in for OneStream, and OneStream seeing extra data that wasn't in the pool calculations for my core accounting system, right? Or, say you pull the definitions in and some of the pool definitions change, you didn't update the pool definitions in OneStream, you didn't refresh them from the source system, right? Or you've manually changed some things, even if the actuals are data has stayed the same, there could be small differences in the calculations just because the definitions don't align. So it's really making sure that you've got the timing sequenced, and you're kind of staying on a good path as you do period end closes.
Sure. Well, and again, that comes to tying the process to the technology, right? I mean, can we
Yeah.
force? We could force the engine to always refresh your definitions from your ERP so that you don't ever lose the definition. But that's kind of a
Yep.
double-edged sword, because then what if I want to make some changes and I don't want it to pull that, right? So it's always just, there's always trade-offs that you got to kind of keep in mind. And yeah, I think it's important to really think ahead of time about how you really want to use that a solution like that, so that you can make the proper trade-offs, so that you can choose the right things that make sense for your business, for your process. Yeah, no, I think that's really fair. And it is also, I'd like to point out that the actual validation did go relatively easy. The budget in FPR was a little bit harder, in part because we had to track down. Some people thought they had put budgeted numbers in there that we didn't actually have, right? Like, oh no, oh my pool cost supposed to be way bigger. Why isn't it? And you go back and you go, well, that's the exact number that's in the budget. I'm pulling the exact number. And they're like, well, I guess we didn't update that, So always,
Yeah.
again, coming
Yeah.
down to data validation can be tough if there's any questions about that kind of stuff. But that's also, I mean, that's really
Well,
typical of any implementation, I would say.
yeah, of course, of course. And I think data validation against a coded system
Mhm.
is one thing. Another really tough part is always is validating forecasted rates against an Excel model, right?
Yeah,
Because it's really easy to make small mistakes in an Excel model, right? And
yeah,
so sometimes what we find is, hey, we've actually built something correctly in the calculations, and there were minor tweaks or plugs in the Excel model that weren't in the source data or weren't
yeah,
built into the calcs, and that's also just something you have to work through to
yeah.
finalize the solution and feel confident in the data validation.
I got to say that's one of my. I kind of have to smile because I remember over again a number of different projects when the model that you build is better and more accurate than what they had before, and like, oh, the data's wrong, it's wrong, and they do the investigation like, oh no, it was our Excel model that was wrong. It's like, all right, that's a win right there. And that gives you a lot of confidence in the system, though, right? And that also is again one of the big benefits of bringing anything onto a system like OneStream, but especially OneStream, is the auditability of all the data points. How do the data points get there? Right, and what's going on, and then where calculated A times B equals C is set. I mean, there's a number of projects we've done in the past, again, in other places, where companies went from an audit risk to passing audit with flying colors in half the time normal, because they were able to just supply all the documentation to the auditors in a really clean, clear, easy to understand way that made the auditors go, yep, beautiful, you're good to go, right? So those kind of things, that's another good reason, to look at this kind of thing in OneStream. It's just way easier to back up why you got where you're going, or where you got to.
Yep, makes sense.
Okay, here's another one for you, Colt. How do most government contractors handle indirect cost budgeting?
That's a tough one because there's a lot of options, and it really depends on your size, your complexity, who's responsible for the budget inputs on the indirect side. We've seen things vary from even all indirect costs are budgeted by project, and then you do project budgeting for indirect and direct, which certainly can work, especially for smaller government contractors. The tough part there is that it's just a lot of extra, workflows, budget inputs, and you really have to try to make sure that you're flowing down assumptions correctly across the different budget stakeholders and the way that they're building up their indirect costs. Um, we've seen mixed models where certain aspects of it they want to have by project, other aspects they don't want to have by project. So a big thing you might see, especially, is like, hey, all my back office support functions or my home office or shared services, they all charge to the same project, and they're all kind of independent, like individual departments, right? Or a handful of projects. So maybe it's a higher level project in my project structure of my hierarchy for that dimension, right? So actually, I would like to budget by project for these specific functions, but for my actual revenue generating side of the business, that's a lot of work, right? You're talking, you're talking a lot of employees that charge to a mixture of different types of indirect cost categories. And not only
Mm-hmm.
that, but a range of projects, especially when you start looking at like bid and proposal, IR&D projects. Those are projects that vary. And a lot of times you don't even know all the bid and proposal projects that are going to be in the next year. So those typically are done in more of like buckets, right? And we've seen things range from, hey, I want to plan people by bucket, right? And you can even leverage the people planning solution, like one of the clients did, to do that, right? Hey, I know John Smith and April and whoever else, right? They're going to budget 5% of their time in overhead, 10% of their time in B&P, 5% in IR&D, 10% in G&A, and maybe some of this person is in facilities, right? And then the residual all falls out into direct and should be somewhere on my direct project side, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then you could also just go super high level, like, hey, just generally for each of these business units or for each of these parts of my org structure, these are the total dollar values that I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Typically, I think a lot of times the government likes to see more detail of, hey, how did you build up to that number, right? What's your justification for that number? Like, is it a
Mm-hmm.
people build up? Is it based off of historical results? Like, give me some backup support of why you're making those forecasts.
Yeah.
And so there's really a range of options to you, and it really depends on how granular you want to be. So you're kind of balancing like keeping your process simple, but also keeping it accurate, right? And
Yeah.
so I think it's just a matter of what works best for your organization and your size, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
tying the whole thing together.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And there's a lot, man, choosing again, we talked a little bit about this already, but choosing the level of detail with which to plan is a really core and key decision point for any organization to say how low level do we really need to go. And it's a balance. It's always a balancing act. And I often like to say I'd much rather be generally right than precisely wrong, because sometimes if you get too granular, it leads you way off. You know what I mean? And people planning can be an example of that, where especially, I mean, having people try to go, oh, this person's got healthcare plan A and this person's got healthcare plan B. It's like, man, I don't know if that's worth the level of effort you're putting into it, especially when person A leaves, 12 months earlier than expected or something, and then that just the whole budget's, off by way more than just that. Or we had to hire 10 new people faster, or we didn't hire the 10 people as fast as we thought we would. Those kind of things have way more impact on the overall budget, as opposed to trying to get down to super little details, right? Like healthcare plans. And so it's always about, I think, choosing an appropriate level of detail. And that really absolutely does vary by business. It varies by how much resources you have and by how much you feel you need to put into it. Sometimes can even vary by budget cycle, because maybe this year, maybe the past 10 years, it's been pretty stable and easy to predict. But this year you had a big change. Maybe you're going after a whole new segment of business, right? And you've got a whole bunch of people who are doing way more B&P work than they ever have before, right? Trying to go out and win this new thing. Well, then you've got to have something to kind of build that up, right? And so maybe just for this year, we do a little bit more detail, at least in that way, and we just kind of subtract that total from our other kind of historical trends in a way. So, it's not something that can easily be set, and and it has impacts on your system, because anytime you go with a system, you're trading flexibility for scalability, reliability, speed, all things worth trading for, but you lose a little bit of flexibility. And so you want to make the right level of trade-offs, especially in the system, because if you trade too much flexibility, if you get too rigid and too detailed, you can really shoot yourself in the foot and lose more than you really need to adapt to the business environment you're in. So anyway.
Yeah, especially, I completely agree with all that, especially when you're talking about people that aren't necessarily, your budgeters. They're not in finance, they're not in accounting, right?
Yeah.
But they're responsible for owning certain aspects of the budget. And if you make that task too onerous, right, it's something that, they lack in how much effort needs to be required if they actually are required to too much detail. And you also just make the process like something that they don't want to do, right? It's not something that they enjoy doing. It's probably at the bottom of their priority list, right? It's more about, oh,
Yeah.
this is my deadline, then let me rush to put something together.
Yeah.
Whereas you really want those budget stakeholders to, I want to use the word enjoy, but like enjoy the budget process and not see it as this
Yeah.
onerous task every year that they just hate doing.
Well, and it's funny you say that, because one of the projects I was probably most proud of in my career has been it was a life science research company where they had legitimately the scientific directors of these different departments they were the budget owners, right? And these are like scientists. They just want to do their research. They don't want to think about numbers. And they had an old system that they didn't like very much at all. And we spent a lot of time in that project making sure that we had the user experience that was as streamlined as possible, that collected the data. Like we were collecting, they had to know how you're going to put their people in their department across certain research bands, right? But again, they had research projects, much like I'm sure many government contractors do, down to like the 12th level org, basically, or the 12th level project, like really detailed for an actuals accounting standpoint. But we couldn't, put that in for budgeting. And so we ended up doing it at a much higher level and at the quarterly level too, not even at monthly, in order to make that a reasonable trade-off. And between that and a lot of the other UI choices we made, we actually had scientists who came back and were like, yeah, we actually kind of liked it, like it wasn't terrible. And I was like, that's a win, like they didn't hate going into the system and doing their budgeting. And that, like you said, from a finance perspective, that gives you much better data. You have easier buy-in, there's more organizational cohesion. And, one of the things that I really like to talk to my clients about is the idea of building a financially aware organization, an organization where not just finance understands how their decisions impact the finances of the company. And so that's a great way to do that, right? Is to make it so where your process, especially your budgeting and planning process, but also that review process monthly to recalibrate, how are we doing against what we said we do? The easier you can make that, the more buy-in you can get from your non-finance people, the better the whole organization functions. Excuse me. So,
yeah.
Good points.
I'm not sure if they embellished a little bit to make you feel good, John, but they really liked it.
Very close to it. I spent a lot of time with these people, and I had some very skeptical scientists who I talked to at the beginning of the process, and maybe they were just blowing a little smoke, but whatever, made me feel better. Okay,
no, I'm sure it was great. And actually, that reminded me one thing I wanted to say around best practices and enjoying the process or making it easier for budget stakeholders. The other thing that really is a best practice, this isn't even just for government contractors, just in general, is trying to make the process clear to end users. Like, why are they responsible for certain things? What does it impact, right? And also, how does it tie to the bigger picture, and how does it tie to the strategic planning process? One thing that we see a lot of organizations struggle with is they have their budget process and then they have this strategic planning process, and they run too independent of one another, and they really need to be closely tied to one another, because you should be making strategic planning decisions and budget decisions in parallel and in conjunction with one another to really understand what's my availability of resources, how do I tie my availability of resources with my strategic planning process? How do I make the decisions around what we do and don't decide to invest in clear to the budget stakeholders, so they don't come out feeling like, oh, I did all this work, I put together a budget, and they just slash my budget and I don't have any reason behind it, right?
Yeah.
Like trying to solicit the buy-in and make people feel like they're inclusive in the full thing and not just their individual piece is, I think, critical.
Yeah, no, I really like that. That's a fair point. All right, getting into slightly different territory. What part of implementing this is the most time consuming? Did we already hit that one? The most time consuming?
I guess we talked about so. We had some most challenging. Yeah,
that's what it was. It was most challenging. But again, because my mind immediately went to data validation. That's a time consuming thing. Especially since in the case of, if we're talking just about the indirect rate buildup, because we have been leveraging the same tool build out across multiple clients now, it's gotten faster and faster every time because we have this great, kind of pre-built thing to work with, and every client needs a little bit of tweaks. That's normal, but from a build perspective, I don't think it was particularly bad. I think it really came down to making sure we got all the data in there correctly, and that we did our own tweaking. There was a couple of technical issues that I ran into while doing some of the coding. It was made me want to bang my head against the keyboard, but I don't think that was particularly time consuming from a general project standpoint. But I don't know, am I forgetting anything there? Is there any other portion of this?
I think this kind of ties with data validation, but also just leveraging source system data mostly, which is, if you're leveraging a lot of structures in your source systems, like your source accounting system or CRM, to build out your dimension hierarchies, to build out your structures for an allocation engine, or build out things for people planning, That makes it easier and less time consuming. But if you have a need to do a lot of alternate hierarchies and there's nowhere that you can really just leverage existing
Yeah, yeah.
structures from, I think that can be time consuming and challenging and trying to
Yes.
get that right, especially from a metadata automation standpoint,
Yeah.
because you don't want to maintain hierarchies and dimensions manually. And if you start to have too many of them, it gets pretty complex, and you have to, it can be time consuming to build out the metadata automation in a way that makes sure your hierarchies are always being maintained.
Yeah, no, that's really fair. I mean, and I guess because all the clients we've worked at have done, I think, a good job of being able to rationalize their structures, and the fact that their rate calculations used already existing structures as opposed to saying like, hey, we need to add data totally different for our rate calculations versus like how we report it internally or externally, right? That makes it a lot easier if you're leveraging those existing structures and, like you said, not having to build multiple alternate hierarchies and maintain them and make sure that they're there. Yeah, that's a really fair point. Being organized in general, that can be obviously very helpful. So yeah, yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and one thing that I've always found as a challenge is if you're trying to use fields in your source system that are kind of like attribute fields to data, like project data or something else, and the end users there are pretty have a lot of flexibility in changing them. That can
Mm-hmm.
also cause headaches
Yeah,
because you're basically then having to account for changes in your metadata automation and then fluctuations in your hierarchies.
yeah,
So it's just something you have to think about in terms of what are the fields I'm leveraging to
yeah,
create these dimension hierarchies and create these solutions in OneStream.
yeah, yeah. So again, just making wise choices about how you're building up those hierarchies and how you're maintaining them over time. And I'll say, you said you don't want to maintain them manually, and it's true. I would recommend as much automation as possible, especially the bigger you get. And I know in the government space, government contract space, most people are not small. Although there's plenty of small government contractors, but I guess most people talking to us about these kinds of things in the government contracting space don't tend to be that small. And so making sure you have that is important. But certain hierarchies, we've had many of our customers maintain them manually without much of an issue. It just comes down to your own kind of individual needs. Always, it's a very consulting answer of it depends, but it really does. I hate it.
I mean, that's
It's a
how
trope
performance
everywhere,
management
but it is.
solutions are, right? I mean, you can
Yeah,
you can customize them how you need,
it's true. Yeah, well, and you
especially in
have to. I mean,
OneStream.
that's why we exist, right? I mean, I always tell people when they ask about what I do, people who don't know or aren't in space, it's always like, well, we help people implement these systems, and they're like, well, don't you just buy software and use it? Because most of us use the commercial software, you just buy it and use it, right? But it's like, well, it doesn't quite work that way, even with accounting software, which again, I think most people just assume you just use the accounting software. It's like, no, there's definitely tweaks that we put in for that and for our stuff too. So yeah, there's always configuration necessary. That's part of why we exist.
Yeah,
So
especially when you layer in the complexities around government contracting.
yeah, there's exactly another thing. Okay, got a couple more questions I see. How many budget / forecast scenarios do you typically see at government contractors? Ooh, that's a good question. I'm curious from your perspective first.
It depends. How often do you want to update your forecast? So in general, you always have an initial budget, right? That's a given, right? I have my annual operating plan, my AOP. That's that's
Yeah,
that's one scenario. Um, and then you'll see a range of things, right? Ranging from, okay, how often do you update that for a forecast, right? What's your rolling forecast look like? I'd say most of the time, at a minimum, you typically see quarterly. Sometimes you only see, half the year forecast updates, and it really depends on your complexity and how much your budget is evolving and changing. Um, I see a lot of government contractors do it monthly, just because they want to stay on top of where they're going. They have
yeah,
armies of project controllers and FP&A support staff that are constantly doing that on a monthly basis.
yeah,
So, I think quarterly or monthly reforecasting is kind of the standard. It's just a
yeah,
matter of what works better for you and what you have staff to actually be capable of doing, and what is required for how nimble you need to be. And then the other scenarios you'll see is whether or not they also deploy what if scenarios, right? So you
mhm,
have your standard annual operating plan, but a lot of times you'll see, kind of conservative or optimistic sides of that, and or maybe even multiple conservative sides of that. And the reason for that is because if you've created what if scenarios off of your annual operating plan, and you
Mm-hmm.
see, oh, hey, we're slipping, like we're going to miss revenue by 5%, you already have a plan in place for, well, what does that mean I have to do on the expense side of the equation,
Yeah, yeah.
right? How do I solve for that? And how do I already have a solution for what happens if I'm missing my targets, right? Or, hey,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm exceeding my targets, right? And this ties back to strategic planning, and I had a bunch of investments that I didn't think I could fund, but now I might be able to fund. What was at the top of the list, or what did I only partially fund that I can now fully fund, right? And looking at that from just a what if scenario standpoint is useful too. So
Yeah.
I think like we keep saying, it depends, but at a minimum, quarterly forecasts and then potentially what if scenarios.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that certainly lines up with what I've seen. I mean, there's a couple points in there that I want to hit on. One was, you said it before. At least in my experience, most government contractors do have those project people checking in every month anyway on all the most important stuff, part of the project. And so, especially leveraging a system like OneStream, you can get all that to flow and get to that monthly forecasting space. Because certainly, regardless of government contractor or not, the most successful companies I've seen at hitting targets and understanding where they're going are the ones that adapted monthly, right? I mean, that's everyone's been talking about rolling forecasts for 20 years now. There's a reason though. It's a thing. It's important to get to, I think, and it can be challenging for organizations to get there. And that's one of the technologies like OneStream are one of the big things that can help get a lot of stuff out of the way so we can make it to that. The other thing that I was going to say about the what ifing is, especially, I think it's especially important for government contractors that have big projects, potential projects coming up. Right, that's something that we have to think about. At least in our professional services, when we're bidding on large contracts, that whether we hit them or not has a depend. It can change the course of where we're going to go, right? And so, making sure you can understand, well, what happens if we lose this, 10-year, $5 billion contract, or what happens if we win it? Like, we need to be ready either way to go. Um, and again, that applies across lots of businesses. Again, that pharmaceutical research one I was telling you about, they had multiple plans for what if our drugs get approved or don't get approved, right? Well, how does that impact what we're going to do? And so,
Yep.
having a system like OneStream makes that what if analysis so much easier, because again, you're intuitively tying the existing budget data, tuning it up, tuning it down, making it easier to put data in. And in the case of that, again, that research company and that dashboard, those scientists were having to flip between those scenarios and say, like, upside, downside on my projects, like, what am I looking at? And really put in that level of granularity of what am I capable of doing? What could I give up if I had to, if we don't make this, if our drug doesn't succeed, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a lot easier to do with OneStream than dozens of Excel templates flying around trying to remember which one I have open and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. No,
So
certainly. And like you said, I mean, most of the time you're updating your estimates to complete for project management purposes on an ongoing basis, whether that's monthly or quarterly or something. So at the very least, you could be feeding that and monitoring how your direct cost side of the equation and revenue buildup is going against your budget or forecast. Um,
yeah,
the other piece, and I think this is where it gets back to the what if scenarios, and you hit on it too. The biggest thing for government contractors is, you know, all the outstanding opportunities, right? And what does or doesn't hit. And if you're big enough, I mean, you could be talking about massive swings, massive contracts, right?
yeah,
And so it might not even be one or two contracts, maybe specific to an organization or BU, but at the higher level, it's really just, in the aggregate, right? Hey, I had $500 million worth of opportunity pipeline. I expected to win 300 million of it. I'm actually only going to win 200 million of it, right? And
yeah,
just kind of monitoring how that goes. Another thing that I've seen a lot with government contractors is doing statistical analysis of it and really looking at historical pipeline sizes at different points of the year, historical win rates, applying that to current pipeline, current win rates, and then just monitoring that, outstanding pipeline data to know, okay, how much is this potentially going to fluctuate my end of year forecast?
yeah. That's cool. Right? I hadn't heard of people using statisticians to do that kind of work. I like it. It's like getting together with some data scientists. Let's find out
Mm-hmm.
some interesting things about the future, right? All right, the last question that I have here. This is good timing. We're right at the hour almost. We have multiple ERP systems. How does OneStream handle that? Some of our project data is in our sales system. How does that work? Well, that's a sub question. I see. So yeah, I mean, and again, OneStream doesn't really care if you're an ERP or a sales system. It's just a different source of data, and it's one of the things that OneStream excels at in general is ingesting large amounts of data from multiple data sources and rationalizing it. Right, and as long as you can rationalize it, as long as there is some, we know how to map data from this point into here, then you're fine, right? I mean, and if you don't, then no system could help you anyway, right? But it's like if you don't know how the data matches up. But again, I think that's something that a lot of our customers have been interested in over time, and we've done a number of ones where, like, again, like maybe existing business comes in from the ERP and Salesforce funnels in our new projects or our new potentials, right? And so we kind of forecast those as two different sales or like revenue streams, excuse me, and we're able to see how those layer out, and again factor in, like you said, PWin and historical. What do we think is going to happen here? Maybe we tweak this project up or down based on what we're saying. In fact, one of the government contractors we did it at, we pulled out of Salesforce and pulled the PWin in right out of Salesforce because the salespeople put their probability in there, and then the finance team could tweak it up or down depending on certain factors. So that's a definite thing to be done.
Yeah, yeah. And, it's just about leveraging the data you already have, bringing it into your performance management solution, and utilizing it. I mean, I've seen, CRM data range from, hey, here's my opportunity, here's the total value of it, and here's my PWin, all the way to, hey, here's how much of it is expected to be labor, here's how much of it is expected to be ODCs, how much is passed through or subcontract based, right? Because all those have massive impacts on your indirects, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then either flowing that data through and PWin adjusting it into your plan, or using it as an informative tool for someone that's going to build up new business project budgets, right? So there's definitely different ways that it can be tackled.
For sure. All right. Well, again, that was the last question that I saw come through. We've got 3 minutes left. If anyone has any further questions, just shout them out. Yell them real loud. We'll hear it over the internet. And or type them in. Actually, is probably the better way to do it. So your office mates don't think you're insane. And looks like I'm guessing we're probably done. I think we answered everyone's questions magnificently, so I'm not surprised there's not more. But if you have anything else, speak now or forever hold thy peace.
If not, you could certainly find our contact information, follow up, join us again on Thursday. Just my first name, period, last name at bakertilly.com. And then, John, what's your email?
just J Moorhead at archetypeconsulting.com. So first initial, last name. Yeah, please feel free to reach out. Always happy to answer questions any way we can.
Yeah, and stay tuned for future webinars.
Absolutely. There'll be more coming.
All right. Thanks, John. Thanks all. Appreciate everyone joining.
Yeah. Have a great day.